Someone You Should Know. A program about people you know, and even more that you don't. Hosted by Stuart Sax, veteran, husband, father, and grandfather. Now, here's your host, Stuart Sax.
Well, hello again. I welcome you to another episode of Someone You Should Know. Very glad to have you with us. We're going to have a very meaningful show today. And as always, we are brought to you by our good friend, Christine Dean, who we all affectionately know as the Networking Diva. Now, what does the Networking Diva mean? It means that this is an expert in her field of marketing and making your website presence and your social media better than it could ever be. All you have to do is reach out to Christine and say, hey, you know what? Take a look at my website. Take a look at what I'm doing and tell me, is it okay? Or do you think it might be tweaked a little bit to make it just a little bit better? She'll give you a free consultation. Believe me, anything that you need to know to make your presence on social media better, you need to have the Networking Diva on your side, Christine Dean. Reach out to her, thenetworkingdiva.com. Thank you, Christine, for everything that you do. We very, very much appreciate it. Today, we're going to be discussing a subject that I really didn't know that much about growing up. It was around us and all, but it has become something that has, I think, come to the forefront a little bit more over the last decade or so. And more people seem to be wrapping their arms around it. And that is the area of neurodiversity. And it's a subject that I think all of us need to be a little bit more aware of. And so I have invited someone who is not only an expert in the field, but also has taken it a step further and has done a podcast of her own in order to share stories of people that you really need to know and wrap your arms around. So Carolyn Kiel, thank you very, very much for joining us on the show. I'm very, very pleased to have you with us.
Hi, Stuart. I'm really happy to be here. Yeah, I'm so excited for our conversation today.
The word neurodivergency, I mean, it's a $20 word there, and decades ago it might have been called something else. I want you to start by sharing with the people that are watching and listening exactly what is neurodivergency and why has it become a more important part of our everyday lives now?
Yeah. Well, yeah, as you said, it really is a concept that's come to the forefront within the last decade. I think it first started to come together maybe in the late 90s and early 2000s was when it kind of started becoming defined. But basically, there's like two different terms in there. So the first one, neurodiversity, is basically, in a nutshell, kind of referring to the concept that all people's brains and nervous systems have natural variations, and that is part of nature. If you think of the word like biodiversity in terms of like all around the globe, all different types of life and every kind of, life that, and, flora and fauna and all kinds of things that exist, but none of them is necessarily like right or wrong. They're just different. And that's the diversity of the sort of biome. Neurodiversity is kind of similar, but it's specific to like the human brain and in some cases the whole nervous system, because it's all connected, body and brain. So that's neurodiversity. And then the concept of neurodivergence is kind of an attempt to demedicalize or take away some of that more stigmatizing and medical type language for people whose brains differ from the quote unquote norms of society or what's considered typical. So for example, say you may have people's the connection between a brain and body and people who are not able to speak. And sort of speaking and spoken language is considered the norm in most of our society. And it's an attempt to say like, no, this is, there are other ways of communication, whether it's through, American Sign Language or typing on assisted devices out, that is natural, that shouldn't be stigmatized. And that's all, sort of part of nature. So it's an attempt to kind of bring in conversations with people who, may have what sometimes are called things like, mental illnesses or developmental disabilities or intellectual disabilities. And it's a big, big, broad umbrella to have that conversation and just learn about people's different experiences and how they experience the world.
Yeah, and I think that we are surrounded by people that are under that umbrella that you mentioned, and it's a matter of us maybe who consider, I don't even know what normal is anymore, but
Yeah.
for those of us who do have all of our faculties together to be able to interact with other people who might be what we've always known as slow, or they were mentally challenged, or as you said, maybe they were deaf and only could communicate through sign language. There are a lot of ways, if we put ourselves out to understanding what this is all about, it makes it a lot easier for the people we're engaging with to understand us and vice versa. Am I correct?
Yeah. And again, it's also, moving, and even at a fundamental difference, trying to move away from language that so many people have used for decades and decades, and that a lot of us grew up with, that is more stigmatizing, like that sort of, demeans and makes people be perceived as less than for whatever reason it is, and just saying
Right.
like, no, this is, we're still looking at some of this may still be considered disabilities, some may just be considered learning differences. There's all kinds of terms, but really is trying to just get away from that stigma and just understand that there are other ways of interacting with the world. There are other ways of processing information, and there's not necessarily like one correct way to do it that everybody needs to be striving for. So it's sort of it's a very different way of thinking. And it's something that I only really started learning about a couple of years ago myself.
Well, that was going to be my follow-up question. Is this something that you have been around in your family for since you were growing up, or is this something that has always fascinated you and you decided to dive into the deep end to know more about it and help people?
Really, it's started a couple years ago from, of all things, from my podcast. So a quick story with that. I've been podcasting with this show since 2018. It was not always focused on neurodiversity. It was more of a general interview show, general interest, people doing interesting things when I first got into podcasting.
Like
And
what
then
we're doing right here.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
This is a very similar type of format, people with interesting stories. And a couple years into that, just through the natural identification of different types of guests and reaching out to new people, I started meeting with a lot of people who had a variety of different disabilities, some physical disabilities, to learn about their experiences and what they like to do, and also some more like developmental disabilities. And I started meeting some autistic content creators, so people on Instagram who were recording videos or writing blogs about their experience growing up with autism or as autistic people. And, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, so my views of autism were very much stuck in those decades. So, we had movies like Rain Man was like really big when I was kind of, in those tween years. And that
Still
was
one of my favorites.
Yeah. And it was really,
Great.
people, it was groundbreaking at the time, because no one was really had any kind of representation of this is what an autistic character could be like. Unfortunately, we didn't get a lot of other representations for a while after that. So sometimes people just thought of that as, oh, that's what autism is. But now, fortunately, we're getting a lot more media where you have more like autistic girls and women represented, more people with autism who are people of color, like different backgrounds, because, all of those interactions of society impact how we view certain types of conditions. So basically, I started meeting and talking and interviewing other autistic content creators, started finding them very relatable as in our conversations, and started learning more about autism myself, and realizing that, not everybody who has autism acts and looks like Rain Man. Certainly some people may, but it's much broader, and it's a whole, they call it a spectrum for a reason. There are some core challenges or differences that autistic people have in order to get diagnosed or identified, but sometimes it comes out differently depending on your culture or where you live or what your gender is, and all different kinds of things. So long story short, I started doing a lot of my own research on autism, found, started relating to it quite a lot, and wound up being curious enough to pursue a diagnosis or an assessment myself. So a couple of years ago, it was the end of 2021, I actually did get diagnosed as being autistic myself. So that was kind of groundbreaking to have that information and that understanding of, oh, looking back on my childhood, I now have a different lens, understanding like what my challenges were, some of the things I went through growing up, and some of the ways I kind of interact with the world today. It kind of fits into this framework. And I realized, like, if I wasn't even aware of this because I just didn't understand what autism was, and didn't recognize it in myself or in anybody else around me, I thought it would be helpful to kind of bring those stories out, not just about autistic people, but other people, and their experiences, because I was kind of interested in everyone's experience. So I've talked to people who have ADHD, who have dyslexia, who have schizophrenia and obsessive compulsive disorder, Tourette syndrome, because all of these conditions are things that, if you tend to have an association in your mind when I say these words from maybe things you've heard about or read about or seen in films. And so it's helpful to get people's real stories and see, like, no, it's actually, some of the representations and understandings that we have of people are very narrow or sometimes stereotypes or misconceptions. So I really like to dig into those stories and just learn about people's experiences with it.
Well, and as you said earlier, all of those words and things that you mentioned fall under that umbrella that you mentioned earlier. And we're starting to learn as a society that while there are specific different types of things that are under the umbrella, it's good to know all of them and how they interact with them. We will be scrolling across the screen for those that are watching and listening, the website, which is beyond6seconds.net. And that, by the way, is not only Carolyn's website, but that is the name of the podcast, Beyond 6 Seconds. So right there is a question that's flashing out right in front of me is, what was the reason or the grasp that you had to name the podcast Beyond 6 Seconds? What's that relevance?
So when I was putting together the whole idea and the planning for the podcast, when I launched right in the beginning of 2018, the name was one of the last things that I was trying to figure out, like just trying to come up with it was like the hardest thing. I had everything else set up. And I based it on a statistic or stories I had read on probably like LinkedIn or some job sites or something at the time, that recruiters allegedly only look at your resume when it comes in for about 6 seconds before they make a judgment on you about, like, I want to talk to this person, or this person's not a fit for what I'm looking for. And while I'm not really sure how accurate that statistic is, it was kind of catchy and people were familiar with it. So I decided, like, well, I want to go beyond those 6 seconds to get past those first impressions that you might have of people, and just learn more about what their stories were. And it worked with the general interview show because I was talking to a lot of people I knew who were doing like really cool and amazing things, whether it was starting businesses or volunteer work or really interesting hobbies. But they weren't necessarily talking about it a lot, either on social media or in offline world. So you would never know just by looking at them or talking to them for a couple seconds that they were doing these really cool and important things. So I wanted to give people a platform to share more about what they were doing. And I just kind of got lucky that Beyond 6 Seconds still worked for people who are neurodivergent, because a lot of times people get judged very quickly. Especially if you are perceived as shy or weird or strange or things like that because of behavior or assumptions people make about you. I wanted to give people the same platform to talk about, like, this is when you were seeing this behavior, like this was what was going on for me. Like this is what I was feeling, what I was thinking. This is what the environment was like for me. This is, what I learned growing up and how I coped. So it's just so, I find it really kind of like an honor and really exciting to be able to fully understand people's experiences, not necessarily standing from the outside making judgments like, a lot of us do because we have so little information, to actually sitting with someone and being like, what is it really like for you? Like what is happening now that you've had time to go back and reflect on your childhood and understand more about your own behavior? So I find it fascinating personally.
You're absolutely right. And that 6 seconds also, I have heard associated with the amount of time, for first impressions, that when you're meeting somebody for the first time, they're analyzing you, you're analyzing them. And usually you come up with a preliminary answer within the first 5 or 6 seconds. Is this do I believe I'm going to be able to talk to this person? Do we share something in common? Is this going to be a fun conversation? Am I going to be challenged? So all of that has to happen within 6 seconds. And also I think it's a beautiful title for doing your podcast. And it also allows you that ability to connect with that person within those first 6 seconds and then get that conversation rolling so that the next, minutes and even hours that you're in a conversation, and it becomes more meaningful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned a few items, and I want to address a couple of them because sometimes young people, when they have a lagging attention span, very often in the school systems, they are automatically thought to be ADHD, and maybe they need medication or something. Has ADHD become too common I hate to use the word malady, but a concept that people are given unfairly?
I mean, I'm really not an expert in this area, so I can't just give medical advice or really,
Right.
What I can say from what I've, seen and read about is, in general, I don't necessarily know if ADHD is overdiagnosed. I know that the diagnoses are increasing because a lot of people are still getting recognized for it because maybe they have, their ADHD isn't presenting as like hyperactive type, because a lot of times that tends to get identified like, oh, someone can't sit still, someone's running around the room or talking
Right.
a lot, like being quote unquote disruptive in the classroom. But some people with ADHD have a slightly different type where they still have that hyperactivity, but it's in their mind. So it's like lack of inability to concentrate on things that aren't like super duper exciting to them, and just other types of what they call challenges with executive function, which is like an example of just going throughout your day, like when you wake up in the morning, remembering like, oh, I have to do XYZ to get ready in this order and remember to do it every time, challenges like that. So, I tend to talk more with adults, some of them who didn't get diagnosed with ADHD until they were later in life, and some who got diagnosed younger. So yeah, I don't really have as much experience with the child and children side or the school system necessarily, but yeah, I can only really talk based on the stories that I've heard. So yeah, whether or not I don't know, it's really kind of up to individual assessments, and medication can be helpful. It's not always the answer. It really has to be an individual plan between like families and children and their medical and healthcare professionals about what really is the best treatment for that person.
And I fear that sometimes it's kind of a catch-all for that behavior and all, and definitely parents, if they suspect that their child is hyperactive or whatever, and I'll talk with your medical professionals, and if necessary, have your child tested to see if they're just being kids or whether there is something that needs to be controlled. Carolyn, the word spectrum, I think, has become more popularized over the last, certainly the last decade, more people have heard the word, more people use the word, more people are starting to understand what it is. For the people that are watching and listening, could you define what someone that is on the spectrum, what the spectrum means?
Well, usually when that term is used, it's a way of describing someone who is autistic. And there's a lot of different language, and people prefer certain language over others. So a lot of times you'll hear me say, like, I'm autistic, or my guest is autistic. That's sort of like that, like identity first language, where we feel like, autism is part of us and part of who we are. Other people will describe people as like having autism, or a person with autism, which is more like person first, which some people prefer, and that's fine. And then there's on the spectrum, which I guess if people are kind of uncomfortable with the word autism, I feel like honestly it's kind of a euphemism. It's not my favorite, but it's not terrible. So, some people prefer that language. And it really comes from the official term for autism spectrum disorder, which means that there's sort of, the diagnostic criteria has evolved over the last several decades, but basically it just sort of considers that it's not necessarily one single presentation. It can be a variety of, what your communication differences look like versus what your need for routine and sort of constricted behaviors look like. I honestly don't know why autism got that spectrum knowledge or spectrum language and the other conditions in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Psychological Diagnosis. I don't know why they didn't get that. I think there's also fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which also has the word spectrum in it, but for some reason they don't get the spectrum language. So it really, the word on the spectrum really is just another way to refer to someone who is autistic or has autism.
Well, am I correct that sometimes using the spectrum as that umbrella, that somebody could have autism and be on the spectrum, somebody could be ADHD, somebody could have Down syndrome, bipolar, are some of those issues that are identified as perhaps being on the spectrum?
No, on the spectrum really is just for autism, and it is only for autistic people, because some people also hear that term on the spectrum and they're like, oh, like, then you start hearing people saying, oh, does that mean that everybody's a little autistic? It's like, no, that's not what that means. It's a spectrum among autistic people as far as like what, and spectrum is so because people tend to think of it as linear, like, more autistic, less autistic, and it's not really that either, which is why I'm not crazy about the term, because obviously it's taking me a very long time to explain it. But it's really more of like, like upstairs, I have like a mixing board for my podcast with like different levels where you can adjust like, different microphone levels. It's sort of more like that, where you might like have a very strong need for like routine and restricted behavior to make yourself kind of function and feel safe during the day. But maybe your communication skills, you're more extroverted and you like pick up on social cues more easily, but still have more challenges than a quote unquote non-autistic person. So yeah, so that's why I struggle with the term on the spectrum, because as you can see, it's kind of confusing. I'd rather just say autistic or has autism.
Well, I'm glad that you clarified that, because again, for those of us that are not well versed in autism and all, it becomes like a general term, and we need to do a little bit of diligence on our own to know the difference. I'm going to throw something at you because I happen to really enjoy it. There is a series on Netflix called Love on the Spectrum. And number one, I want to know is, in fact, I think while we're speaking, they're launching season 4. I find it fascinating because you're becoming a part of the life of people who are challenging their own autism and recognizing it and wanting to share it and all. Do you have a feeling one way or the other about the show? I assume you've watched it.
I have not watched it.
Oh,
I actually don't
okay.
really watch a lot. There are a lot of shows with either people like real life people, like reality shows, like Love on the Spectrum, who are autistic, and then there's other like fictional shows. Like The Pit is another one that has several autistic characters with actors who are autistic. I am very behind on my TV. I really haven't watched anything, so
You got some
it's
catching
pretty
up
bad.
to
It's like
do.
I'm like, oh, I really should watch that, and then I watch other content creators talk about it and share their opinions. I'm like, okay, this is good. I'll just sort of process this. But yeah, I don't know. I haven't watched it enough to say like in terms of how, it's reality TV. So I'm always like a little bit hesitant about like, are they going to edit
Exactly.
it in a way that will want, how do they want the audience to react? Do they want the audience to feel sorry for people, or do they want people to appear like childlike because you can like put certain types of music underneath the scenes to manipulate people's feelings if they're watching? So again, I haven't watched, so I can't have like an informed opinion on that. But yeah, I think it's it is one way to get it out. I know a lot of people do enjoy the show, and I guess potentially it's one way to kind of break down some stereotypes and barriers, and just kind of, I don't know, just put out people who are autistic out into the world so that people get to know more examples of people who are autistic. I think that's just so critical to be able to see that more and more.
Yeah. Is autism generally something that is genetic, or something that someone is born with?
Generally, yes, you are born with it. I really don't think you can acquire it. Like autism, it is something that you're born with, which is why as part of the diagnostic process, you have to go look through your childhood. You can't just sort of show up as an adult and just say, well, I'm autistic, but like there was no, I had no reflections or no analysis of my childhood. There was nothing there that indicated it. Usually there's something, and depending on, who you are and when in time you grew up, it may have been like ignored or misunderstood or misdiagnosed or just, whatever. So it really is something that has to start in early childhood for that. And, the research is still inconclusive. People tend to think there is some sort of strong genetic component, but for the most part, it's not just like one gene. Like, for example, something like Down syndrome is also, trisomy 21, which is that gene, chromosome 21 has that one difference. And that's what, kind of creates and gives rise to Down syndrome. Autism is not tied to a particular gene, but they do notice that there is sort of, if you are an autistic person, chances are you have autistic relatives, or, a lot of autistic parents have autistic children. So there's something going on, but it's complex. So I think it's still in the works.
Well, you said earlier in your own personal situation that as a child, you weren't really diagnosed as being autistic, that it was later in life. What was there something in your makeup, your attitude, that you said, maybe, yeah, I mean, am I just, because I'm interested in autism, I'm going to go get checked? Or what was the process that you as an adult decided to take that step to find out? And then what was it like when you got that positive result?
Yeah, well, for me, for me, it was one, I guess, having conversations with other autistic people, because, I had my own stereotypes and assumptions about, what autistic people were like.
Yeah.
And the fact that I just really could have like deeper conversations. I related to a lot of their experiences. They would talk about growing up in terms of, like social and interacting with other people, those types of challenges, or certain types of like sensory sensitivities is another kind of big thing among us, whether we're either very sensitive to certain types of, noises or lights or something, or very not sensitive, like things are just not, in the other extreme. And so it was a whole list of things like that. And then I started to, it's like, but I don't want to just, I'm not coming to the conclusion of anything yet. It really didn't click at that point. And then I just started reading more about it. Like, what is autism? What does it feel like for people, and just particularly women and girls? Like, how are they perceived, and what does it feel like for them? And some of the reading I was doing is like, yeah, a lot of these words that were used to describe me are also used to describe autistic young girls, like intense or shy, or like, kind of like little professor is another one, like things like that, which is just not something I had thought of. But I'm like, okay, that's interesting. And then sort of with a combination of that, it's like, I am kind of curious about it. I was fortunate enough to be able to find someone who had experience assessing autistic women specifically, because, it can be challenging to, the child assessments are potentially different from adult assessments.
Right.
And it really, because a lot of times with childhood assessments, there's other stuff thrown in there, like, IQ tests and like other types of things that you don't really do with adults necessarily. So I went and pursued that. And yeah, it's several hours of questionnaires and interviews, and potentially reaching out to other relatives and getting their assessments of you as a child. So it's not just like I go in and I like walk out with my certificate that says autism on it. It's an extensive process. It takes a while. So yeah, I wasn't really sure. And yeah, so finding out was like a mixture of emotions, honestly. And it's been several years, and I'm still, I don't know that I've come completely to terms with all of it, but it's a mixture of kind of like relief and maybe a little excitement about understanding more about myself, and things that didn't make sense before, my life finally making sense for the first time, or I had something sort of new to look by it. And then also kind of, there's some like, I'll call it regret, or just, as you're looking back and reframing things, it's like, oh, when I was doing this, or when this was happening to me, I just thought it was because like I was just like a defective person, or like a bad person, or I was just like not, like you kind of start digging up a lot of that self blame and shame around thing. It's like, no, it's not. It doesn't mean that you're bad. It's just that you were different, and that's why you reacted in this way. And then kind of going through and looking through a lot of that was, it's a lot. It's, it's not, it's a whole mixture of emotions. So it's, it's something that takes a while to really work through. So
what you did was you really took it to the next level, because you started Beyond 6 Seconds podcast. And this is what you've been doing this for, what, 6-7 years now?
I think you start 2018. So I think, what is that, 8? I don't know my math. I think it's like 8 years now. Wow. Yeah. So
And again, for those that are watching and listening, that is the website. I invite you to visit it, because you can go into the website and you can click on some of the episodes to see what the interaction is. And Carolyn, do you find that you say you're on this exploration of your own experiences and all, when you share these with other people in your podcasts and everything, it has to be, a dual purpose. You're not only sharing and learning from your guests, but you're also using it to, recognize and support the feelings that you are having.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it is a type of coping mechanism that I guess I've developed with the show. It is. And that's why, I always say, I think I've interviewed maybe like 55 of my guests who are autistic, specifically autistic, and they come from like all around the world. They've had all different kinds of like, their different ages and different like life experiences and backgrounds, but we always connect on something, at least one thing in common that we have. There's always just that sense of like, understanding each other. And, I think part of it is that they can come onto my show and realize that because I have this experience, that I'm not going to, it's not a gotcha show. Like, it's not investigative journalism. It really is like, share your story. And I'm here to support you and to understand and, help really share what's going on with you. So I think people appreciate that. And I always appreciate learning about other people, and it helps me learn about myself as well. So yeah.
Well, and I'm in my 11th year of doing this show, and it's the same thing. I usually will bring someone onto the show as a guest because of a certain hobby or career that they have, but I'm always interested in that backstory, where it started and how it developed. And rather than it being a simple Q&A, by having a conversation with people, you have a tendency to learn a little bit more about what they're doing and why they've chosen to do it, and maybe how they have shifted through the years in order to be doing what they're doing. You just recently had a young lady with Down syndrome as a guest on your show, and she is a runway model.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started listening to the podcast, I realized this young lady, in her own mind, even though she maybe have living her life with Down syndrome, there is no barrier that is too high for her to climb over. And she is not going to be stopped in any way, shape, or form. And do you find that in your general interviews with your guests and all, that this is what you encounter? People that just say, no is just not an operative word for me.
Yeah, I think probably the majority of my guests, that's a good summary of their approach to life. And of course, a lot of the people that I find who are out sharing their stories have that approach. And that's why they're out talking about it and, achieving things that get on my radar as a podcast host. I tend to find it's interesting in terms of what people are able to achieve or have achieved. It's a combination of, kind of who they are as a person and what their interests are, what motivates them, what their innate talents and what their interests are, and the type of support that they have around them. So I've been fortunate enough to interview, I think maybe 4 or 5 guests on my show who have Down syndrome specifically. And I'm always struck by the, all of the really cool things that they're interested in doing, that they're passionate about, that they do, a great job of doing, and also the support that they have of whether it's family or friends or organizations who actively are there to support them and want them to succeed. And, a lot of times, mom or dad is their manager, basically it's kind of if you have an agent or a manager, that's, they're their talent agent, and they help them get in, like any of us might have a talent agent. Maybe one day I'll have one, but
Sure.
that sort of thing. So it's that interesting combination of, I can't attribute everything to just the person or just the support system. I find anyone who has a really strong mix of both tend to go on to do really amazing things.
You are a credit to what you do, because your career is more of a corporate career. But this is something that is a fascination for you that you have turned around to share with other people. And that's why I say to the audience, you don't have to be on the spectrum. You don't have to be autistic and all to really enjoy the conversations that Carolyn has with some of her guests. I encourage you to go to the website and watch some of these, because you will become a better person for it. And all. Carolyn, thank you very, very much for taking the time to be with me. I very, very much appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stuart. I'm really happy to have been on your show. Thank you for inviting me, and it was great to talk with you.
Well, I end my show every week with Oscar Wilde, be yourself because everyone else is already taken. And I think that you can connect with that, because you are one of those people too. So again, thank you for dropping in and watching this episode of Someone You Should Know. Go out and make it a great week. And again, a big, big thank you to Carolyn Kiel, my very, very special guest.
Thank you.
Someone You Should Know